going to kind of riff off the AI from the last one, and I think this actually ties in more than Dawn would have expected when she selected the article. So what's going on here, Dawn?
Yeah, a couple things jumped out at me when I saw this. Of course, many of you know I live in Colorado, and this was about an art contest that occurred in Colorado. The artist is a guy named Jason Allen. He's actually a game designer that lives in Pueblo, West Colorado. He won first place in this emerging artist division, and it was for digital arts, digitally manipulated. I think that's a key word, photography category at the Colorado State Fair Fine Arts Competition. His winning image was called Théâtre d'Opéra Spatial, Space Opera Theater, and it was made with Midjourney. It's an AI system that can produce detailed images when fed written prompts. Well, here's the rub, everybody. The judges didn't know that he used AI pretty much almost exclusively to create this. Now, what he said was, I think he had like 900 iterations and he had to manipulate those. And then he also used, what's that, kind of finishing software. He used another software. I forget the
Photoshop?
name. I apologize. Yeah, he used Photoshop to finish it, things like this. But I'll tell you, and it was only a $300 prize, right? So the stakes weren't high here. But, just from a philosophical standpoint, for many people, and especially many artists, it was a big deal. And you had folks just jumping out on Twitter. I love this quote, so I'm just going to say it. Some Twitter user wrote, quote, "This sucks. For the exact same reason we don't let robots participate in the Olympics." And,
Mm.
it does. It raises so many interesting questions because, the human, kind of machine AI interface, where's the line drawn? And it really does, Mike, as you said, it ties into a previous Full Crew episode where an inventor had submitted in the United States a couple of patents that his AI created the design completely, and he listed the AI as the inventor. And the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office said no. There needs to be a human inventor under the law, and the court agreed under the terms of the statute, under the language of the statute, it had to be human. So, think about that in terms of art, because so much art, it gets copyrighted, it's intellectual property. I just see a lot of connections between that last article and this, but also the kind of societal implications to this. What does art really mean, and who gets to create it, and how much robot is okay to still be called truly art? So I know this is all mind blowing because we're talking about metaverses and we're talking about flying cars, and now we're talking about, AI just creating beautiful works of art with a little bit of human assistance.
Could I go first on this
I
one, Don?
Yeah,
I got a lot
please,
on
yeah,
this. So as
yeah,
somebody
yeah.
who started as a designer and had to learn all this tech stuff, the the idea that it's no longer art because somebody used a tool is like saying that every piece of art has to be completely alla prima from the person's mind. Like, oh, I painted this perfect human body. What about, just the methods that they used in the Renaissance, like setting up wires to make sure they had the thirds? Is that no longer art now? What about the camera that uh, I'm using now? You could take beautiful landscape photography of it, and is that not art? And one of the most like hated kind of moments in art school, because I went for one semester, was when this photographer took somebody else's photo and then put a different frame around it, and the teacher wanted us to talk about the philosophical implications of it. And my whole thing at the time, and I still stand by it, is, well, she sold it, so somebody thought it was art. And yes, applying a new frame to something is an iterative process. You've created new context for the piece, and legally and emotionally, it's art unless you want to be angry about it because it was too easy, right? So that's kind of the issue here. And the truth is, there's an assumption of easiness. So actually, our thumbnail is going to be used with Wamba Dream. We're going to use some AI art to actually create the thumbnail for this episode, just to kind of make the point at how easy it is to get started. But to get to the image that this person actually created, having used these tools, it requires an understanding of how that tool works. His prompt was probably over 500 words, which means he tested how it looked each time, and then he still had to refine it. So the person is still definitely in the loop here, and if a computer generated 10,000 images all by its own with no input, I don't think we would call that art because there's no narrative, especially in the West. Actually, I'll limit that to just the West because there's different contexts for art globally. But in the West, we tend to think of art as narrative. Like, what's the story, right? People buy the story behind a piece. I think about Banksy's piece that he tried to, ruin through the shredder as it was sold. The minute it was sold, and then the shredder broke. That just sold for, I think, 4, maybe 5 times its original auction costs. Why? Because it's got one of the best stories in art history. So you want to buy a piece of that story. So that's my take on this. It's still art. It's an exciting new evolution. It's a nice new tool.
I
So,
think
Vijay, go ahead.
sorry, I just want I paint a lot and I like it and I draw and we've got artists in our lineage. My grandmother paints, my mother paints, and it's like never ending. I mean, like there's Klimt right there at the back
Oh,
as well.
cool.
Um, so I mean, like I love art, and I love all the eras and the evolution. So I do agree with Mike here. This is an evolution. I think there is a bit to this in terms of the fact that if somebody using Midjourney won an art contest, I don't necessarily think like if it's a Midjourney only art contest, I get it. But if it's not, then I don't because it's still a situation where I would still argue, maybe from my point of view, where it's not necessarily the most skill based or technique based or years of practice based sort of result that you've achieved. There was a respect at some point for that in the traditional scope of art or any format of art where it was practiced and then perf perfected and then the result was sort of given over.
Yeah, but
I
that's
think in,
okay. Sorry,
yeah,
I don't want to cut you off.
sorry. So just with regards to this, I think it's a medium, it's a tool, but I think the biggest problem and why it's becoming a moot point is the fact that I would assume it's 70% or 80% plus of the job is being done by the tool and not necessarily. So it's like 20% on the person running the program. So I use Photoshop, and then sometimes there are things that Photoshop to do. And I know lots of people using Midjourney right now, and you can create some really amazing looking stuff. It's a creation. I don't necessarily think that I think it's still a creation or an exploration. I don't think it'll ever sit at the level of a Klimt or an impressionistic kind of masterpiece, right? Because
Yeah.
that's years of somebody either going through a crazy life and then telling a crazy story with each piece of work. So
Yeah, that's
so
kind
yeah,
of my point. There's a story to Klimt. You're buying the human's journey, right? Everything that took them to get to that point is what makes it interesting to us
yeah,
as people. Otherwise, it's just wallpaper, right? We don't consider wallpaper art for that reason. And yeah, I kind of agree. But I could actually mark the moment in Western art history where skill no longer becomes part of the conversation, and that's the Impressionists. So that's
mm.
when concept enters the frame. Um,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
absolutely.
So
I think I agree with that completely. And I think I can also mark eras where certain different things and facets became part of art altogether, right? There was pres like an engineering level of precision to something like the Bauhaus. There was
yeah,
there was a mixture of an engineering level of precision and a very decorative feel with something like Nouveau. So you've had these really interesting sort of facets come in, and I think this is very much the beginning of what Midjourney and other sort of it really links very well, I would say, all the articles so far. I think I can find so many different bridges to cross now. It's quite weird, and
yeah.
I would
Well,
probably
I
I
know
do
was
it's
more.
talking with a friend about like we're using these for 2D right now, but at some point I'm gonna have this in my Houdini console when I make, you know, images, and it's like, oh, it's not looking right. Type make it look more like a frog, and then I start sculpting from there. right? So
Yeah.
you're going to see a massive evolution in complexity of art because basically you're getting the entire knowledge of every other artist who's ever worked also at your fingertips, and I think that's the massive change with this.
And
Yeah.
that's
I
a
have
great segue
one.
over to Cam because he's like our AI guy. So, Cam, what are your thoughts
No,
on this? I mean,
I am so happy being on a which happens often for me on a podcast where I'm like the least smartest person, and this is you know, both you guys got this nailed, and I
So
wish I
humble,
would
Kim. Honestly.
I know I'm like thinking I just found an article. I have no idea.
Oh man, it's I agree with you guys. I would love to disagree for the sake of a good podcast, but the reality is I think it's art, and you know, for like somebody, you know, looked at it and said that is the best piece of art here. Full stop, end of story. And there is a story behind it, and I do agree that the skill to come up with a piece of art that could compete on an IA basis with, you know, people that are using other tools like a paintbrush or such, or that there is real skill there. Like any one of us can go in and put in a bunch of words into an AI engine and come up with something, and it's generally it's obviously not art. It's like novel at best. So I think it's and I do think it will segment into, you know, AI art, you know, just like there's watercolor or oil or ceramic or whatever the case is, and then AI will have 1,000 different, you know, kind of subsections underneath that, and the market itself will determine, you know, where it places value, when it places value, what are the cultural contexts around it at that time. There'll be different times when certain AI will be worth more than an oil painting by a master or vice versa or whatever the case is. But I think it's amazing. It's an expression of story. It's an expression of the human psyche and the human interest, the human tale, everything about it. And at 100%, we, in my opinion, we should be embracing it rather than, you know, any time in history we've seen something to say, oh, that's not right, and we've got to repress it. You know, how many years or generations later where it's like, man, those people were stupid thinking that, you know, like
Well,
this you know.
I like where both of you are going because, you know, I guess, you know, being a lawyer and a little bit of a stickler that words matter, digitally manipulated was the division, and was it digitally created? Like, is there a difference? Like, is there a difference? And if there was an AI category and it was completely transparent, you know, for this judge to be like, oh, I didn't really know at all that he used that, you know, what it was, but I thought it was just really cool. Well, that's great, right? But like to Mike's point earlier of what if, you know, I don't have access to those tools and I'm competing against this. I do think the Twitter person, as crass as they were, has a point. If there's a robot races in the Olympics, great. We're all going to cheer them on. That's really cool. Let's do it. I would love to see that, honestly. But if it's robots competing against humans and you don't even know they're robots, I've got a problem with that. And I guess I'm making this really simple here, but I think just a little bit more transparency, and absolutely, I'm not disagreeing. It's art. I think in this case, it would have been great. Almost like when you buy, you know, food now, all the ingredients are listed. Let's talk about what went into this thing, you know, before I'm competing against someone that didn't have, you know, that capability of those tools or whatever. So.
All right, I'm yeah, Vidya.
I'm just saying I'd call it accessible art, you know. If anybody can do it, I think it's the fact that people who may not want to pick up a paintbrush or may not want to kind of sit there for hours on a canvas have the ability to kind of use tools that they're maybe more familiar with. I can think of Generation Z being huge, you know, like this becoming the norm for them. But I
Yeah.
can also see the flip side to this that makes real paintings a lot more expensive, which is
Yeah,
going to be a bit
yeah.
Yeah, there's
mad.
usually an ironic twist like that, right? Yeah, it's very,
Yeah.
very true.